September 5, 1943. A cold, gray dawn hung heavy over Fort Ogulthorp, Georgia. Mist curled around the barbed wire fences like a ghostly shroud as a convoy of buses rumbled to a halt outside the camp's gates. Inside those buses sat 120 women, former auxiliary members of the German Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, their faces pressed against the windows, hearts pounding with dread. Rumors had spread like wildfire since their capture in North Africa and Italy. Whispers in German spoke of an execution wall waiting for them, a place where prisoners were lined up and shot. The women had heard the stories, whispered in the shadows of makeshift camps, murmured aboard crowded Liberty ships. They feared they would be treated not as soldiers but as criminals, and that death awaited them. As the bus doors creaked open, the women braced themselves for the worst. They expected grim-faced guards with rifles at the ready, a cold stone wall or gallows looming in the yard. Instead, what greeted them was something utterly unexpected. A wooden frame stood in the center of the compound, with two iron hoops nailed to backboards, nets swaying gently in the southern breeze. A basketball court. The women stared in disbelief. Where they had expected death, they found a place of play. This moment would be etched forever in their memories. A collision between the terrifying propaganda they had believed and the strange, almost impossible reality of American captivity. The shock was not just that they survived, but that they discovered something new. A world where mercy and abundance existed even for enemies. The journey to this moment had been long and silent. The train ride from North Africa to the coast was filled with a suffocating quiet. Women in gray uniforms sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the passing Algerian countryside, each mile bringing them closer to the Atlantic and an uncertain fate. Captured in Tunisia and Italy, they had been herded into holding camps, smaller in number and more conspicuous than the thousands of male prisoners. For men, captivity had a bitter predictability: processed, sent to camps, forced labor, or left to rot. But for women in German uniform, the rules were unclear. Some whispered that the Geneva Convention did not protect them. Rumors grew darker with each retelling, that the Americans had prepared firing squads, that women soldiers would be executed as criminals. Fear clung to them like a second skin. On the Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic, suspicion was thick in the air. The vessel was massive, steel-bodied, bristling with cranes and lifeboats. Guards herded the women below deck with brisk efficiency, neither cruel nor kind, just indifferent. They were given bunks stacked 3 high rough wool blankets and metal trays for meals. The food was astonishing: white bread, butter, coffee, even real meat. For women used to wartime scarcity, barley crusts and ersatz coffee, this bounty felt surreal, almost theatrical. Many suspected it was a trap, a way to fatten them before execution. At night, the women huddled together, whispering fears of parades through American towns as trophies, forced labor, or the dreaded execution wall. The phrase haunted them, repeated until it became a grim certainty. Yet the Americans showed no cruelty. Guards spoke little German but were measured, almost courteous. When seasickness struck, medics offered aspirin and water without hesitation. This kindness only deepened suspicion. "They want us to trust them," muttered one nurse, "so the betrayal will hurt more." Days at sea stretched on, the dissonance between expectation and reality growing. On deck, sailors laughed and worked, young men tossing crates as if war were just another job. The ship's mess hall smelled of real coffee, rich, dark, endless, a luxury the women hadn't tasted in years. They watched in disbelief as food was wasted: half-eaten bread scraped into barrels, bacon left cold on plates. No nation could be this careless in wartime, they whispered. Had to be a trick. When the coastline finally appeared, gray and distant, terror surged anew. America, the decadent, broken land their Führer had condemned, rose before them. They pressed against portholes, expecting barbed wire, gallows, concrete walls. The execution wall awaited. But what they found was something else entirely. The convoy rolled steadily into Georgia, the buses rattling along the long highway toward Fort Ogulthorp. Inside, the women sat rigid, their hands clenched tightly in their laps, eyes darting nervously between the guards and the world beyond the glass. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of tires on pavement and distant sounds. A dog barking, a car horn, faint laughter carried on the warm southern breeze. Every noise seemed amplified, every moment stretched taut with tension. As the convoy passed through small towns, the women's eyes widened in disbelief. Electric lights blazed from storefronts and houses, illuminating streets in a way they had not seen since before the war. In Germany, blackout regulations had swallowed the night since 1940. Darkness was a shield against Allied bombers, and people stumbled home by candlelight or the dim glow of a lantern. But here, across the ocean, the Americans seemed to pour light into the sky carelessly, as if the war were nothing more than a distant rumor. Neon signs flickered in vibrant colors, diners stayed open late, casting warm glows over cars lined up outside. Teenagers laughed and skated past jukeboxes glowing through cafe windows. One prisoner whispered, "This is a dream." Another shook her head muttering, "It's a show staged for us." But the guards laughed softly, watching the women's wide-eyed wonder. This was no performance. This was everyday America. Billboards towered above the road, advertising cigarettes, Coca-Cola, radios, and shoes. Smiling families and happy women grinned down at the prisoners, mocking the grim austerity they had known. In Germany, shops stood half-empty, ration cards dictated every bite, and families patched worn clothes until the fabric gave way. Here, abundance was on display everywhere, as if the only problem was choosing what to buy. The convoy rolled deeper into Georgia and the night grew warmer. Children in cotton dresses darted across porches chasing fireflies, their laughter ringing like bells. Radios played big band music through open windows. Cars gleamed beneath street lamps, hundreds of them, far more than any prisoner had ever seen. Private automobiles were a rarity in Germany, a luxury reserved for the wealthy and party elite. The much-promised Volkswagen, the people's car, had delivered almost nothing. Yet here, factory workers and farmers alike owned cars, parked casually as if they meant nothing. The women whispered among themselves, some in awe, others in anger. How could a land so rich exist in wartime? How could people live so well while their own country starved? When the convoy finally reached the gates of Fort Ogulthorp, fear surged again. The women straightened in their seats, bracing for humiliation, punishment, or the dreaded execution wall. The camp loomed ahead, barbed wire fences and wooden guard towers silhouetted against the glow of floodlights. The gates clanged open and the buses rolled inside. Hearts pounded as the women prepared to be herded into barracks no better than barns, to be stripped of dignity and reduced to cattle. But instead, the doors opened to something entirely different. Freshly painted barracks stretched in neat rows, their whitewashed walls reflecting the floodlights. Inside, the prisoners found rooms lined with bunks, each made with crisp sheets and a pillow. For women accustomed to lice-ridden straw mattresses or damp floorboards, the sight was almost unbearable. One officer, Aubryn Greta Hoffman, later wrote in her diary, "We entered expecting a death camp. We were shown to rooms with mattresses and pillows. I lay on the bed and cried." The smell of meat stew drifted from the kitchens, rich and savory. The prisoners, exhausted from the journey, inhaled deeply, their hunger gnawing at them even as suspicion persisted. Surely this was not normal. Surely this was another trick. Yet the kitchens bustled with activity. Steam rose from great pots of vegetables and beef. Loaves of bread were stacked in baskets. American cooks prepared meals for enemies as if they were honored guests. The contradiction was too much to process. And then they saw it. In the center of the yard, beneath the stark glare of floodlights, stood a wooden frame with 2 iron hoops nailed to backboards. Nets swayed lightly in the night breeze, a basketball court. The prisoners stared in disbelief. In Germany, such a sight during wartime would have been impossible. Wood was rationed, iron reserved for the war effort, recreation abandoned in the struggle for survival. Yet here the Americans had resources to waste on play. To the German women, hardened by scarcity and discipline, the sight was almost insulting. Where they had expected death, they found a game. Where they braced for cruelty, they discovered leisure. The basketball hoop became more than a curiosity. It was a symbol of American power, not flaunted with arrogance, but displayed casually as if to say, "We have so much we can even spare this." To the prisoners, it felt like insult wrapped in generosity, an abundance so complete it mocked their suffering. That night in the barracks, whispers filled the air. Beneath the fear, a new doubt stirred. Perhaps everything they had been told about America was a lie. What unsettled them most was not survival, but the possibility of living better in captivity than they ever had in freedom. The days that followed at Fort Ogulthorp unfolded like a slow unraveling of everything the women had believed about their captors, and about themselves. The basketball hoop in the yard, once a symbol of confusion and disbelief, became a quiet beacon of something new, a hint that captivity here might not be the nightmare they had feared. One warm afternoon, under the relentless southern sun, the American guards gathered a group of prisoners in the campyard. The women stiffened, bracing for humiliation or punishment. Their eyes flicked nervously toward the wooden frame that had haunted their imaginations like a gallows. But instead of cruelty, a guard tossed a leather ball into the group. It bounced awkwardly across the dirt until one of the women hesitantly stooped to pick it up. Confusion rippled through the prisoners. The guard grinned beneath his cap and mimed throwing the ball toward the hoop. The women exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, a tall auxiliary, her face set with suspicion, tossed the ball weakly toward the rim. It clanged against the iron and fell, prompting laughter, not the cruel laughter of conquerors, but the easy, amused laughter of men watching something harmless and almost childlike. The guard bounced the ball again, demonstrating how to dribble. He passed it back. The women hesitated, then tried again. Their stiff skirts and blouses were ill-suited for running and leaping, but within minutes, awkward passes and clumsy shots gave way to a chorus of shouts and laughter, half in German, half in broken English, echoing across the yard. The execution wall had become a basketball court. By evening, diaries that had once been filled with suspicion recorded hesitant notes of bewilderment. "I thought they would shoot us," wrote Margaret Keller, a stenographer from Hamburg. "Instead, they gave us a ball and told us to play." What struck the women most was the casualness of it all. The guards had not staged this for propaganda. They seemed barely to care whether the prisoners enjoyed themselves or not. For them, the hoop and the game were just part of life. But to the German women, raised in scarcity, trained in obedience, and conditioned to expect cruelty, the sight of Americans offering play to their enemies was nearly incomprehensible. In Germany, play had been a luxury reserved for children before the war, and even then, it was quickly consumed by ideology. Games became drills, youth groups militarized, recreation bent toward service. Leisure did not exist outside the party. Here, in a camp surrounded by barbed wire, the Americans built space for it, as if it were as essential as food or shelter. To the prisoners, that casual abundance carried a sting more devastating than punishment. It was as if the Americans were silently saying, "We have so much power, so many resources, that we can afford to waste them on play, even for our enemies." Not long after, the strangeness of American captivity deepened. Workshops opened within the camp, not with tools of forced labor, but with sewing machines, knitting supplies, and even typewriters. Women were summoned in small groups and found themselves seated before humming Singer machines, taught to stitch uniforms, dresses, and practical garments. Others were handed needles and yarn, encouraged to knit socks or scarves. Some were offered typewriters, their metal keys clacking as they relearned office skills they thought lost to the war. It was not forced labor but a kind of training, recreation mixed with utility. The contrast was surreal. German propaganda had painted American camps as places of chains and starvation. The reality offered workshops, recreation, even skills that could carry into life after the war. Diaries described the shift with astonishment. "I sat at a sewing machine," one prisoner wrote, "with good cloth, good needles, good thread. We worked as though in school, not prison." Another recorded the sight of a knitting circle forming in a corner of the barracks. Women bent over their yarn, gossiping and laughing as if war and captivity had been suspended for a moment. The Americans seemed indifferent to the symbolism of what they were doing. To them, basketball hoops and sewing needles were tools of discipline and morale, methods to keep prisoners occupied and docile. But to the women themselves, they became lessons in another kind of power, the power of casual abundance. They began to sense that what Germany fought for, struggled for, and sacrificed for was something the Americans gave away freely, even to their enemies. A ball, a needle, a typewriter. Small things that carried the weight of entire nations' futures. Suspicion did not vanish overnight. Many still whispered of hidden traps, of tricks waiting to reveal themselves. But cracks had formed in the wall of paranoia. The first hesitant smiles appeared. Laughter, once rare and brittle, began to echo through the barracks. They still believed themselves prisoners, still feared what lay ahead. But curiosity had taken root alongside fear. And all of it had begun not with speeches or propaganda, but with a ball arcing clumsily through the air toward a hoop nailed to a board, and with the soft clatter of a sewing machine needle piercing cloth. The hoop stood in the yard, swaying in the breeze, no longer a gallows in their imagination, but a reminder of something far more dangerous to ideology than execution could ever be. It showed them that the Americans redefined power, not with cruelty, but with a kind of careless generosity that was impossible to ignore. As the weeks turned into months at Fort Ogulthorp, the women began to experience a reality that challenged every expectation they had carried across the ocean. The initial shock of survival gave way to a slow, sometimes reluctant acceptance of a new kind of captivity, one that was far from the brutal nightmare they had feared. The basketball hoop in the yard, once a symbol of confusion and disbelief, had become a quiet emblem of this strange new world. But it was not just play that marked the difference. The camp began to offer opportunities that no one had anticipated. Work assignments took the prisoners beyond the barracks and into the surrounding community. They were not chained or forced into back-breaking labor, but instead sent to farms, textile mills, and canning factories. The women watched in stunned silence as combines roared through cotton fields, harvesting in hours what villages in Bavaria could not process in months. Corn was cut, stripped, and piled into mountains that seemed endless. American farmers stood casually, cigarettes dangling from their lips, speaking of harvests as if abundance were inevitable. The women, raised in a world of scarcity and sacrifice, were ashamed of their disbelief. How could a nation at war produce so much? Factories shocked them even more. Housewives in aprons, secretaries who had once typed letters, now operated machines with skill and authority. They laughed with one another, argued with foremen, and even spoke back to male supervisors without fear. It was not chaos but equality. For women raised in a culture where obedience was demanded and a husband's word was law, this was a revelation. One prisoner wrote bitterly, "We were told democracy enslaved women. Yet I saw Americans treating women as comrades, not servants." Each day of labor pushed the prisoners further from the certainty of Nazi propaganda. It was not speeches or lectures that changed them, but the undeniable sight of America's casual wealth and confidence. They worked in canning factories where tomatoes rolled down endless conveyor belts, sealed and labeled by machines that never tired. They labored in mills producing cloth in quantities Germany could not have imagined in peace, much less war. The longer they labored, the more undeniable it became. America's wealth was not performance or propaganda. It was fact, laid bare in every field, every factory, every smiling face that treated women not as subjects but as equals. December 1943 arrived with frost on the barracks windows and a heaviness in the women's hearts. They had resigned themselves to captivity, to long days of work and long nights of uncertainty, when the first surprise came in the form of packages stacked high in the mess hall. Brown paper boxes tied with twine, each marked for the prisoners. The guards explained awkwardly, as if the generosity required justification, that churches, schools, and civic groups from surrounding towns had gathered them. Chocolates, cigarettes, soaps, perfumes, even hand-knit scarves spilled out as the women opened the gifts with trembling hands. They stared in silence, unable to reconcile the fact that strangers, citizens whose sons fought and died in Europe, had chosen to send kindness to enemies. "Even for us?" one prisoner asked in disbelief. The guard's answer was simple, yes. On Christmas Eve, the camp chapel filled with music. The women shuffled inside, expecting a perfunctory service, perhaps even a sermon meant to humiliate. Instead, an American choir began singing, still, soft, and unadorned, in flawless German. The melody rose into the rafters and broke whatever defenses the prisoners still clung to. Many wept openly, their tears falling not for Germany, nor even for their lost freedom, but for the mercy they had not thought possible. One diary recorded the moment with stark clarity: "We expected hatred. We found charity." The next day brought a feast. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted turkeys, glazed hams, mashed potatoes, gravies, vegetables, pies, and bowls of ice cream that melted into sweet pools before anyone could finish. The women ate until they could eat no more, stunned into silence by quantities of food they had not seen since childhood. In that moment, ideology cracked. If Americans could treat enemies with such abundance, then the stories of cruelty and weakness they had been told were nothing but lies. The basketball hoop outside, once mistaken for a gallows, now seemed the perfect symbol. Here in this strange land, even prisoners were given the space to eat, to sing, to play, and to dream. But life at Fort Ogulthorp was not all kindness and feasts. The women still faced the harsh realities of captivity. They were prisoners, after all, confined behind barbed wire and under constant guard. Yet the contrast between their expectations and their experience was so stark that it forced them to reconsider everything they had believed. Education became another unexpected part of their lives. Notices posted in the camp announced classes in English, typing, mathematics, and even lectures on subjects none had dared imagine prisoners would be allowed to study. American universities sent correspondence materials carefully chosen but not censored. Some prisoners enrolled with hesitation, convinced there must be a hidden purpose, while others rushed eagerly, hungry for anything that filled the long days. Within weeks, barracks that had once echoed with whispers of execution walls now hummed with recitations of English grammar, the clatter of typewriter keys, and the quiet scratch of pencils over workbooks. The most shocking lessons, however, came not from classrooms but from the camp theater. Several evenings each week, the guards opened the doors to a hall where a projector rattled against the back wall. The women filed in expecting crude propaganda, images meant to humiliate or frighten. Instead, the reels flickered to life with American cinema, Gone with the Wind, sprawling and emotional, its scenes of burning cities and ruined families resonating even across language barriers. Then came The Grapes of Wrath, a story so raw and unflinching that the prisoners exchanged stunned glances. The Americans were showing their own suffering, their own failures, and not to hide them, but to expose them even to enemies. Comedies by Charlie Chaplin followed, laughter rippling through the audience as the little man mocked the powerful and stumbled through life with resilience. In Germany, such openness was unthinkable. Films existed only to glorify the party, to exalt sacrifice, to demonize enemies. To see Americans willing to criticize themselves, to laugh at their own leaders, was a revelation. It made the idea of democracy seem not weak but impossibly strong. One prisoner whispered after a screening, "If we showed such films in Germany, we would be shot." Books were placed in the prisoners' hands, novels, histories, poetry, even banned German works. Some devoured American newspapers comparing differing opinions printed side by side. The very existence of choice and debate was a lesson in itself. Slowly, the conversations that once revolved around suspicion began to change. Women debated democracy, questioned the party line, wondered aloud about what kind of Germany might be possible after the war. Some admitted their doubts in diaries that survived long after, fragile paper carrying confessions once too dangerous to speak. One diary captured the transformation in a single line: "I came here believing the Führer had built the greatest nation. But I see now our nation was built on lies. Here, even their play is greater than our work." Each day, the basketball hoop in the yard clanged with shots and laughter, its net swaying in the wind. What had once been a symbol of confusion had become a kind of teacher. It was not words alone that shifted the prisoners' minds, but the living evidence of a society confident enough to teach its enemies, to laugh at itself, and to offer freedom even within captivity. In those lessons, belief collapsed and something new began to grow. As the months passed at Fort Ogulthorp, the women's lives continued to shift in ways they had never imagined possible. The camp, once a place of fear and suspicion, had become a strange kind of school, a place where lessons were learned not only in classrooms but in everyday moments, in conversations, and in the quiet spaces between fear and hope. Education became a cornerstone of this transformation. Notices posted around the camp announced classes in English, typing, mathematics, and even lectures on history and politics. American universities sent correspondence courses, carefully selected but uncensored, allowing prisoners to study subjects that had once been forbidden or censored in their homeland. Some women approached these opportunities with hesitation, convinced that every kindness must hide a trap. Others embraced them eagerly, hungry for knowledge and a way to fill the long, uncertain days. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere changed. Where once there had been whispers of execution walls and whispered fears, now there were sounds of recitations, the clatter of typewriter keys, and the scratch of pencils on paper. Women practiced English phrases, learned new skills, and debated ideas that had been suppressed for years. The camp theater became a gathering place not just for entertainment but for reflection. Films like Gone with the Wind and The Grapes of Wrath showed the prisoners a world of complexity and struggle, of human resilience and failure, far removed from the propaganda they had known. The prisoners were struck by the openness of American society, its willingness to confront its own flaws and laugh at its leaders. This was a stark contrast to the rigid control and censorship they had experienced in Nazi Germany, where films and books existed only to glorify the party and demonize enemies. The very existence of choice and debate was a revelation. Books were distributed freely, novels, histories, poetry, even banned German works. Some women devoured American newspapers, fascinated by the range of opinions printed side by side. The idea that people could disagree openly without fear was almost unimaginable. Slowly, conversations shifted from suspicion to curiosity. Women debated democracy, questioned the party line, and wondered aloud what kind of Germany might be possible after the war. In diaries that survived long after, some prisoners confessed their doubts and hopes. One wrote simply, "I came here believing the Führer had built the greatest nation. But I see now our nation was built on lies. Here, even their play is greater than our work." The basketball hoop in the yard, once a symbol of confusion, had become a teacher, its net swaying in the wind as shots rang out, laughter echoing across the camp. But education was not limited to books and classrooms. The women learned from the daily acts of kindness and the unexpected freedoms they were granted. They saw guards who treated them with respect, who did not mock or humiliate. They experienced meals that were abundant and nourishing, far beyond anything they had known. They witnessed a society confident enough to offer mercy to its enemies, a society that believed in the possibility of change. This new reality forced the women to confront painful truths about their own pasts and the ideology they had been raised to believe. The propaganda that had shaped their lives began to unravel, replaced by a more complex understanding of humanity and power. The war, once a clear battle between good and evil, became a story of shades and contradictions. Some women struggled with this transformation. The loss of certainty was frightening. The idea that their nation's leaders had lied, that their sacrifices might have been in vain, was a heavy burden. Yet, for others, this new knowledge was liberating, a chance to imagine a different future. The camp became a place of quiet resistance, not against the Americans but against the old beliefs that had imprisoned their minds. In whispered conversations and written words, the prisoners began to reclaim their voices. They debated politics, religion, and philosophy. They shared memories of home and dreams of what might come next. Outside the camp, the world was changing too. The war was turning against Germany, and news filtered in of battles lost and cities destroyed. The women watched the seasons change, feeling the weight of history pressing down on them. Yet within the barbed wire fences, a small seed of hope was growing. In the spring of 1944, the camp's routine was punctuated by moments of celebration and reflection. Holidays were observed with a mix of solemnity and surprise. Christmas had brought unexpected gifts and music, breaking down walls of fear and suspicion. Easter services offered moments of peace and contemplation. These occasions reminded the women of their shared humanity, transcending national and ideological divides. The prisoners also began to form bonds with the American staff and local communities. Some were invited to attend church services in nearby towns. Others participated in volunteer projects or cultural exchanges. These interactions, though limited, were powerful reminders that the world was larger and more diverse than the narrow worldview they had been taught. As the war dragged on, the women faced an uncertain future. Some hoped for release and return to a homeland they barely recognized. Others feared what awaited them: destruction, poverty, and the collapse of everything they had known. Yet all carried with them the lessons learned behind barbed wire, that kindness could exist in captivity, that education could open minds, and that even in the darkest times, hope could take root. The basketball hoop remained a constant presence in the campyard, a symbol of resilience and change. It was a reminder that life could continue, that joy could be found even in confinement. The sound of bouncing balls and laughter echoed like a promise that the world could be different, that freedom was not just a dream but a possibility. In the years to come, many of these women would carry the memory of Fort Ogulthorp with them, not as a place of defeat, but as a place where they glimpsed a new way of living. They returned to a shattered Germany, but with seeds of hope planted deep in their hearts. Seeds that would one day help rebuild a nation not on conquest and fear, but on democracy, freedom, and human dignity. In the spring of 1946, after nearly 3 years behind barbed wire, the gates of Fort Ogulthorp finally opened. The women filed out, their German uniforms replaced with civilian dresses pieced together from parcels and second-hand cloth. The trucks that carried them to the ports rumbled through an America that seemed unchanged by war. Towns still glowing with neon lights, shop windows filled with goods, streets alive with the hum of everyday life. But this time, their eyes no longer widened in suspicion or disbelief. Instead, they looked out with something closer to longing, a quiet awareness that they were leaving behind not only captivity but a vision of a world that had remade their very understanding of life. The journey back across the Atlantic was starkly different from the one that had brought them. On their first crossing, fear had gripped them, every wave seeming to carry them closer to an execution wall. Now the ocean carried them home to a future they could not yet imagine, a future shaped by the lessons learned in captivity. In their satchels lay more than clothing or keepsakes. Some carried certificates from typing courses or notebooks filled with English phrases. Others clutched knitting needles, scraps of patterns, or medical texts borrowed from camp hospitals. These were not trophies of survival but tools for rebuilding. What awaited them was devastation. Cities reduced to hollow shells, streets littered with rubble, homes blackened by fire. Families met them at train stations with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. Hunger lingered in every house, and despair hung as heavy as the smoke still drifting from ruined neighborhoods. Yet the women returned with something their neighbors did not have: the memory of another possibility. They had seen abundance where they were told there was only decay. They had seen democracy where they were told there was chaos. They had been treated with dignity in a foreign land, while their own nation had demanded obedience and sacrifice without end. Their voices were quiet, often overshadowed by the grand narratives of generals and battles, of men's captivity and re-education. Women's experiences were pushed aside, folded into silence. But their diaries, tucked away in trunks, and their memoirs written in old age revealed something extraordinary. They had been changed not by punishment but by the example of a society that could afford mercy. The basketball hoop, once mistaken for an execution wall, became a symbol etched forever into memory. They spoke of it again and again, the day the guards handed them a ball instead of a rifle, but the moment laughter replaced terror. That hoop stood for everything the war had tried to destroy but which freedom had preserved. The possibility of choice, of play, of life lived without fear. One of them, Anna Kraus, captured it best in her 1983 memoir. They conquered us not with bullets but with kindness. We came home defeated soldiers. We returned as witnesses to another way of life. The hoop we feared was an execution wall became our doorway to freedom. Her words spoke for many. They returned to a broken nation but carried with them seeds of something new. And in time, those seeds would help Germany rise, not as an empire of conquest but as a democracy built on lessons first learned behind barbed wire, beneath the shadow of a wooden frame with iron hoops swaying gently in the southern breeze. The transformation was not immediate or easy. The ruins of war were everywhere and the scars ran deep. Many struggled to reconcile their experiences in America with the devastation at home. Some faced suspicion or hostility from neighbors who could not understand how they had survived or what they had learned. Yet the women's stories endured. They became part of a quiet revolution, a testament to the power of mercy and education to change hearts and minds. Their memories challenged the old narratives of hatred and division, offering instead a vision of reconciliation and hope. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes, the lessons of Fort Ogulthorp echoed in unexpected ways. The values of democracy, equality, and human dignity, once foreign and suspect, began to take root. The women who had lived through captivity became teachers, nurses, writers, and leaders, carrying forward the ideals they had glimpsed in a distant land. Their diaries and memoirs, once hidden, have since been studied by historians and scholars, revealing a side of the war rarely told. They show how captivity, when tempered by kindness and opportunity, can become a crucible for transformation. The basketball hoop remains a powerful symbol, not just of survival but of the enduring human spirit. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is room for hope, for laughter, and for the possibility of a better world. As we look back on this story, we see more than prisoners behind barbed wire. We see women who faced fear and suspicion, who confronted the lies of propaganda, and who emerged changed by the unexpected generosity of their captors. Their journey teaches us that true power lies not in domination or cruelty but in mercy, education, and the courage to imagine a different future. And in that lesson, there is a timeless hope for all of us.